Lyra walked silently through the long metallic hallway of the orbital station, as if her feet were trained to avoid making a sound. The lights above cast a dim silver glow across the smooth floor, reflecting slightly on her polished utility belt and the curved armor plates around her legs. Her posture was always straight, but her eyes were always low, avoiding attention even in the crowded sections of the station. Other workers passed her, some nodding at each other, some chatting as they carried equipment or checked data pads, but none of them looked at Lyra. Not because they did not notice her, but because they did not care to. She had learned to live inside that silence. It had become her shield, her quiet space where no judgment reached her directly, although the echoes of unspoken thoughts always floated around her. Lyra belonged to the Thalans, a strong and proud race with sharp features and a rigid social structure. Their society had always valued physical perfection, tactical instinct, and flawless genetics. Every citizen was tested, evaluated, and ranked based on their usefulness to the greater cause. Some were chosen as warriors, others as breeders, and a rare few were granted both honors. Lyra was granted neither. Her record said she lacked desirable gene sequences in her bone density and neural reflex alignment. It did not matter that she had the strength to carry double her weight or that her hands moved faster than most during complex repairs. The charts and codes spoke louder than her actions ever could in Thalan society. From a young age, she was told to accept her place. She would not lead, she would not fight, and she would certainly not be chosen for breeding. Her blood was not suitable, her form not desirable. She had learned to stand still during ceremonies while others were called forward. She had watched quietly as peers were matched and celebrated while she remained a footnote in the background. When the Unity Accord opened, opportunities for Thalans to work on joint missions with humans and other species, her elders encouraged her to apply, not because they saw potential in her, but because it meant one less mouth to feed and one less reminder of flawed heritage now. She spent her days inside the maintenance sector of Unity Station 12, surrounded by machines and quiet energy pulses. She worked alone most of the time, tightening connections, sealing damaged conduits, and running diagnostic reports. Her supervisors rarely spoke to her except to assign shifts. The humans were more talkative, but they usually kept to their own groups. Lyra never tried to join. She had grown used to being invisible, and she had convinced herself that it was easier that way. No expectation, no pain, but today something was different. She had received a new task assignment in the early cycle, and her schedule showed a joint repair shift with a human technician named Alex. She had heard the name before, mostly in passing. Other workers mentioned him often. He was known for being efficient, calm under pressure, and strangely kind to everyone. Lyra was unsure how to feel about this pairing. Humans were unpredictable. Their behavior did not follow the cold calculations she understood. They laughed loudly, complimented each other for small things, and showed emotions even when it served no clear function. It confused her. She arrived at the repair bay early, checking the toolkit and scanning the data logs on the panel wall. The system failure was minor, a repeated overload in one of the plasma conduit rings. It was not difficult work, but it required synchronization between two operators due to the tight space. She had worked similar tasks before with other Thalans. They usually gave instructions, completed the task quickly, and left without a word. She expected the same rhythm today. The footsteps came before she saw him. Alex stepped into the bay with a slight smile on his face and a relaxed posture. He had short hair, a faded utility vest, and gloves clipped to his belt. He greeted her casually, as if they were old friends. His voice carried a softness she was not used to. When she nodded without responding, he chuckled lightly and said no problem. They would get along fine with or without words. They began the repairs in silence at first. Lyra preferred it that way. She slid into the tight conduit path while he managed the stabilizer coils. She moved with practiced precision, her hands finding the damaged section without hesitation. As she worked, she felt his gaze now and then, not heavy or judgmental, just curious. After a few minutes, he spoke again, not to give orders, but to comment on her technique. He said she moved like a dancer, smooth and strong, like someone who knew every inch of the station by heart. Lyra froze for a second, her tool pausing mid-turn. She had never heard anyone describe her like that. Not even in jest. Her own kind had called her silent, distant, functional at best. She continued working without replying, unsure how to process the words. After the shift ended, Alex walked beside her as they returned to the central hub. He talked about simple things, the texture of the corridor walls, the way gravity felt slightly lighter near the energy core, the food options in the human cafeteria. He asked if she ever tried human tea. She shook her head. He laughed and said he would bring some next time. She did not answer, but her mind held on to that thought longer than she expected. Later that night, in her private quarters, she sat on the edge of her small cot, staring at her reflection in the dim panel screen. She tried to remember the exact tone of his voice when he said those words. Strong and graceful, no one had ever said such things to her. Not her teachers, not her peers, not her own parents. It was such a small sentence, so simple. Yet something about it pulled at a place in her chest she thought had closed long ago. She told herself not to overthink. It was just a human being polite. They were emotional creatures. They spoke easily. But no matter how many times she repeated those thoughts, the warmth in her chest would not fade. She had not expected this. She had not prepared for it. And now she could feel the silence inside her begin to shift that night. She did not sleep as she usually did. She lay awake listening to the faint hum of the station, wondering what tomorrow's shift with the human would bring. Next cycle began with the same rhythm across the station as machines hummed and personnel moved between sectors with urgency. In their steps and devices in their hands, but something inside Lyra felt slightly unsteady, not in a way that showed on her face or posture. But deep within her thoughts, a strange sense of waiting had formed. She told herself it was foolish to feel this way just because of a few words from a human technician. Still, her eyes kept moving to the schedule screen again and again to confirm that she had another repair shift with Alex, and when the time came, she arrived 10 minutes early, standing by the tools with her arms behind her back, trying to look as if she was simply focused on the task ahead. When Alex arrived, his voice broke the quiet like sunlight slipping through clouds. His greeting carried no tension, just a warmth that made the air around her feel a little lighter. He noticed her early arrival, but did not mention it. Instead, he walked over with his usual relaxed step, picked up his gear, and started discussing the task they were to complete together. Today they had to recalibrate a coolant channel running beneath one of the secondary power units. A narrow crawl space that required them to work close and communicate without delay. As they walked to the site, Alex began talking again, not with heavy questions or complicated theories, but small stories from his past. He told her how he used to fix his family's old heating system on Earth, how his younger brother once poured orange juice into a cooling vent because he thought it would make the air smell better, how their father had laughed for hours instead of getting angry. Lyra listened without replying, but something about the way Alex spoke made her want to keep listening. There was no pressure in his words, no hidden test, just a steady river of memories shared without fear of judgment. When they reached the narrow chamber, Alex let her go first again, allowing her to lead the repair process as he adjusted the settings from behind. She slipped into the passage carefully, every movement efficient and smooth, while the metallic walls around her reflected a dull blue light from the running systems. She began inspecting the faulty connectors, noting which ones had worn down and which simply needed tightening. Then from the opening behind her, Alex spoke again, not loudly, not jokingly, but in a soft, thoughtful tone that somehow carried deeper than any command ever had. You know, the way you move down there is kind of amazing, he said. You're steady and fast like you were born to do this. It's like you understand machines better than anyone else I've worked with, and I mean that, Lyra. stopped moving for a moment, not because of confusion in the task, but because of confusion in her chest. Her hands held her wrench, her legs were steady, her vision clear, yet something in her heart stumbled. She had been called capable before by machines, by data readouts, by shift logs, but no one had ever spoken such words directly to her like that, especially not with such genuine belief. She finished the adjustment in silence and backed out of the chamber. Alex offered her a hand out of habit, not knowing whether she would take it, but to his surprise she did for a brief second. Her fingers touched his palm and a strange feeling passed between them, not romantic, not electric, but human and real. She pulled her hand back quickly and stood straight again, trying to mask the flicker in her breath. He only smiled and moved on, gathering tools for the next section. As they worked side by side, she began asking small questions, at first about the system, then about the materials, then eventually about Earth itself. What did mountains feel like? What did winds smell like? Were the oceans really that wide and endless? Alex answered every question without hesitation. Even when she paused or looked away, he kept the conversation flowing like a quiet current, carrying them forward. He told her about forests where sunlight touched the ground like gold, about birds that sang only before dawn, and about how sometimes rain made people want to cry and smile at the same time. Lyra found herself imagining those places, not with the cold logic of data input, but with a longing she had never allowed herself to feel before. The idea that such places existed made her question why her world had always been so small, so cold, so limited in its sense of beauty and meaning. She wondered why her people feared softness, why they avoided emotion as if it were a disease to be purged, not a gift to be understood. They finished their shift early and walked slowly back to the main corridor. Alex stretched his arms behind his head and joked that if she ever decided to quit engineering, she could become a trainer for precision repair units, because even the bots couldn't match her skill. Lyra did not respond with words, but something inside her shifted again, not in confusion, but in quiet acceptance. Maybe not everything he said was true. Maybe he exaggerated. Maybe humans simply liked giving compliments. But a part of her wanted to believe it, because for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her not as a defect, not as a mistake, but as something valuable. As they reached the sector split, Alex paused and turned slightly, his voice low enough that others passing by would not hear. You know, Lyra, most people I work with just want to get the job done fast and move on, but with you, it feels different, like we're part of something real, and that's rare out here. I just wanted you to know that. She stood still after he walked away, her body unmoving, but her thoughts racing. The station around her kept buzzing. The lights kept flickering, the air kept flowing, but her world had changed slightly. She did not know how or why or where this path would lead, but she knew something had begun to grow within her, a feeling not of pride, not yet of joy, but of being seen, of being heard, of being something more than a quiet name on a forgotten roster. She walked back to her quarters, slower than usual, each step not heavy, but deliberate, and for the first time, she opened her datapad and typed a small note to herself. She did not save it, she did not send it, but she wrote it, and read it twice. He sees me. Then she closed her eyes and let the stillness around her settle like a blanket, not cold, not sharp, just soft and real. Lyra awoke before the morning cycle lights had brightened across the station. Her eyes were open, but she did not move. Her mind was awake long before her limbs remembered they were part of her body. There was no alarm, no emergency, only a strange quiet pulsing within her chest. A sensation she had never known before, not painful, but not peaceful either. Like a song with missing notes or a memory that never truly happened. She stared at the ceiling above her bunk, counting the tiny grooves in the panel until her shift began. That day she walked into the repair bay with her shoulders less tighter, steps less controlled, and when Alex turned and smiled at her, the expression she gave back was small, but real, not forced, not polite. Just a flicker of something trying to live again. They began their work without too many words. Today's task was more complex, involving a control valve inside the energy regulator unit. and though the area was tight and the risks of pressure loss were higher than usual, Lyra felt calm, perhaps because she was not alone in that narrow space, perhaps because someone was finally walking beside her, not behind her, not ahead of her, just beside her. As they worked, their hands moved in perfect sync, without needing many instructions, and Alex spoke between tasks, telling stories of strange foods on Earth, of people dancing without music, of animals that loved their humans, without needing a single word. Lyra asked questions again, not as tests or formal exchanges, but as small windows opening. Slowly she wanted to know what a dog looked like when it was happy, how rain felt on bare skin, how people smiled with their whole face, not just their mouth, and Alex answered each one not with long speeches, but with truth spoken in simple lines that made her heart feel less like stone and more like something soft waiting to grow. After completing the main repair, they sat beside the unit, waiting for the pressure to stabilize, and Alex looked over at her not with curiosity, but with something deeper and quieter, something that asked a question without sound. He tilted his head slightly, then said something she had never heard before, something that wrapped around her soul like warm cloth. "You are enough, Lyra, exactly as you are." Words entered her not like sound, but like breath-filling spaces that had long been empty and cold, and she did not know what to say back, because no one had ever told her that she was enough, not once in her life, not even in moments of success, not even in moments of silence where no one had noticed her at all. She had always tried to be useful, to be silent, to be invisible, because her people said she was not what they wanted, not good enough, not perfect. Enough, not strong enough for breeding or fighting or leadership, but now a human, a simple technician with soft eyes and a voice like calm rivers, had looked at her and spoken as if all those old judgments meant nothing. She turned away for a moment, pretending to check the control panel, but her hands stayed still and her mind spun like a broken turbine. Alex did not push her to respond. He simply stood and offered her a water pack as if nothing had happened, and maybe for him, it was nothing. Maybe humans spoke like that all the time, but for Lyra it was something huge, something that shook her quiet world in a way she could not stop thinking about. Later that cycle, they were called to a new task, a malfunction in the gravity coil deep inside the cargo section, where the risk of collapse was high and the magnetic force unpredictable. They moved fast into the zone with only limited time to stabilize the field. Lyra took the lead, moving through narrow access points and adjusting coils while Alex provided the external power redirection. They worked as one unit, fast, smooth, fearless, and then without warning the system glitched and a surge shook the wall beside her, throwing sparks into the air and threatening to ignite the panel. Without waiting, she reached out and pulled the main regulator loose, disconnecting the surge channel with her bare hands, risking burns to save the circuit. The jolt pushed her back and she fell hard against the inner frame, but the system stabilized and the danger passed. Alex rushed inside without hesitation, ignoring safety to pull her into the clear, and his voice filled the narrow space, not with panic, but with concern that felt like fire and shelter at the same time. "You okay? Are you hurt? Look at me." Lyra looked at Mesh, nodded slowly, her vision blurry, her arm shaking, but the heat was already fading, and the pain was only faint. Alex held her arms gently, not to restrain her, but to remind her that she was not alone, and for the first time in her life, she let someone hold her not as property, not as rank, not as weakness, but as a person who had just given something of value to protect others. They sat in silence again. After medical cleared her minor injuries, she was fine, bruised and tired, but fine, and Alex sat beside her on the bench in the hallway between sectors, not speaking, just breathing slowly, like he knew she needed the silence to understand what had happened. After a long moment, Lyra spoke, her voice low and uncertain, not because she feared being wrong, but because the words were still new in her mouth. She asked him why he said she was enough, why he spoke to her, as if she mattered, as if she was not broken or lacking. And Alex turned toward her, his voice calm and clear, "Because I see you, Lyra, and you're not broken. You're just someone who's never been given a reason to believe in yourself, and maybe your people measure things one way, but that doesn't make them right. I don't care about their charts or scores. I care about what I see, and what I see is someone who is brave and strong and kind, someone who makes the people around her better just by being herself. Lyra stared ahead, not blinking, not moving, only listening as his words pressed into her bones like truth she had never known, and slowly, very slowly, her chest began to feel lighter, not free. Not healed, but lighter, like the first breath after being underwater too long, like the first sunrise after endless night. She did not smile, she did not cry. She only whispered something soft enough that even she barely heard it. Thank you, that night. She returned to her quarters and sat by her small window, watching the stars beyond the glass. They had always looked cold to her, distant and sharp like the eyes of those who judged her, but tonight, they looked different, still silent, still far away. But softer somehow, like they were waiting for her to rise and meet them, like they believed she could. The days passed in a quiet rhythm across the station where life followed systems and schedules, and numbers moved faster than voices, but something within Lyra had begun to shift, and that shift echoed in the way she now carried herself through the wide corridors. Where once her footsteps had been careful, and her presence barely noticed, now there was a quiet firmness in her walk, a steady focus. In her eyes, not pride, not confidence as others knew it, but the early breath of something growing that no one had thought would ever grow. Inside her, she continued to work alongside Alex, and each task they completed together seemed to add another invisible thread between them, not binding or trapping, but connecting, like soft lines drawn in space, where silence was no longer empty and words were no longer weighed with fear. He continued to speak to her as if she was already whole, not someone waiting to be fixed in his way of seeing. The world had started to seep into her thoughts, filling cracks that had once held only cold voices from long ago. She began speaking more, not just to him, but even to others, when needed, her words still short, but no longer shrinking from sound, her thoughts still careful, but no longer afraid of being heard. Sometimes her fellow workers noticed the change. They looked at her a moment longer than usual, perhaps wondering what had softened the edges of the one they used to call silent. One day, during a routine task, a younger worker asked her how she had learned to move through narrow systems so fast, and instead of walking away or giving a technical reply, she told him the truth, that she had been doing it for years because no one had trusted her with anything else, and that over time the small paths had become her space of clarity. That honesty surprised the worker, but he nodded with respect, and from that moment she began to see the way others responded to her, not with pity, not with confusion, but with something closer to recognition. They were beginning to see that she was not just useful, but worth listening to, not just capable, but quietly resilient, and in that space where her presence had once been nothing more than an unnoticed breath, now there was the beginning of a voice. But not everyone welcomed this change, for her people had never looked kindly upon difference, and the idea that someone like Lyra, someone deemed unfit by the old systems, could now speak with strength, was unsettling to those who had once turned their backs on her. One afternoon, as she returned from a deep system inspection, she was summoned to the Thalen office chamber on the upper deck, where her assigned superior waited. With eyes like steel and a voice that carried no warmth, he questioned her not about her tasks or performance, but about her interactions with the humans, particularly the one named Alex. He spoke of cultural balance and dignity and tradition, and then he reminded her of her place, of her category, of her genetic limitations, as if words alone could undo what she had begun to build within herself. Lyra did not lower her head this time. She stood straight and answered clearly and without hesitation. She told him that she had served the Accord with discipline, that she had risked her safety for the station, that she had acted with courage when the moment demanded it, and most of all, she told him that a human had seen her worth before any of her own people ever had, and that maybe it was not her who had forgotten the traditions, but them, who had forgotten how to see value beyond numbers and ranks. The superior said nothing more and dismissed her, but the silence in that chamber was not like before. It was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of a wall beginning to crack. And when she stepped out of That room she felt lighter, not because she had won anything, but because she had spoken without apology. Word spread slowly across the Thalen quarters that Lyra had defied the old voices and spoken of worth in a way that did not depend on ranking. And over the next few cycles, she noticed others watching her from a distance, especially the ones who, like her, had once stayed at the edges, the ones who were never chosen for advancement, the ones who walked with quiet shame in their eyes. And one evening, as she passed the lower engineering lounge, a young Thalen girl stepped in front of her holding a tool. In shaking hands, and asked if she could help her learn to repair the cooling units, because she wanted to become better even if the elders said she never would. Lyra looked at the girl and saw herself from years ago, and without thinking she said, yes, not as a leader, not as a teacher, but as someone who had once stood in the same darkness and had been offered light by a stranger. And so she began showing her what she knew, guiding her with calm patience and no judgment. And soon more came. Not many, not loudly, but in ones and twos, those who were ready to believe that maybe they were more than their assigned worth. Through all of this, Alex remained a steady presence, never asking for more than she offered, never pressing her to speak faster or act differently. He simply stayed near, sharing quiet stories and warm tea packets and gentle reminders that people were not machines, that sometimes value came not from design but from choice, and that kindness was not weakness but strength. One day he told her that his station contract would end soon, that he would be assigned to a deep space vessel where cross-species cooperation was being tested further, and that he might not return for a long time. And Lyra felt something twist inside her, not pain, not fear, but something heavy that reminded her how much his presence had shaped her own becoming. Before he left, he gave her a small object wrapped in old cloth. When she opened it later in her quarters, she found a thin mirrored plate, etched with a single word written in her language with imperfect lines, but perfect meaning. It said worthy. And when she held it in her hands, her breath caught, not because the gift was rare or valuable, but because someone had seen her, had believed in her, had left behind something that would never fade. She placed the plate above her bed, and every time she returned from work, she looked at it for a moment, letting the words settle deeper each time. And in her chest, something continued to grow. Slow, steady, quiet, like a tree rising from soil once thought barren. And every new day felt not easier, but more possible, not brighter, but more open. Time flowed through the station like a silent river, where shifts came and went, where lights changed color to mark hours, and where memories slowly layered themselves across the walls and air and footsteps. But inside Lyra, time moved in a different way, slower, quieter, deeper, like a slow fire warming what had long been cold. The space around her did not change much, but the space within her had grown wider with each passing cycle. She still walked the same corridors, still carried the same tools, still completed the same reports, but her presence now carried weight where once there had been only shadow. The young Thalen girl she had begun training now followed her regularly, asking questions without fear, showing eagerness without shame. And soon 2 others joined, and then a 4th, until Lyra was no longer walking alone. She never called them students, and never claimed to be a guide, but her quiet ways and steady work drew them like leaves, turning toward sunlight. And she taught them what she knew, not just the systems and machines, but the quiet courage to keep trying when no one believed in you. And that message grew slowly from one voice to another, until it became a ripple that touched places even she could not see. Among the humans, she had gained a silent respect, the kind that did not need announcements or praise. The way her name now appeared on shift requests without being questioned, the way she was trusted with tasks that required not only skill but instinct, and the way those who worked beside her now paused to hear her thoughts, as if her opinion mattered. Not because it was loud, but because it was earned. She still kept the mirrored plate near her bed. The word etched into it had not faded. It reflected the soft light above her quarters. With quiet pride, every night she looked at it and remembered the way Alex had spoken without needing answers, the way he had seen her before she had seen herself. And though he was now far away, assigned to a deep vessel in a system she might never visit. His voice still echoed within her, not in sound. In the shape her thoughts now carried. One evening during a sector upgrade review, Lyra was asked to give input before the final protocols were approved, and though many high-ranking officers were present, she spoke clearly without fear, describing the repair flow, the material efficiency, and the importance of allowing less-ranked engineers to rotate through critical modules so they could learn and grow. Her words were calm, not loud, not aggressive, but filled with something undeniable, and when she finished, there was no laughter, no silence of doubt, only nods of agreement, and that quiet moment became a stone placed within her memory, a reminder that her voice now mattered. Later that cycle, she walked through the outer ring where few others passed and where the station wall met the clear glass dome looking into the stars, and there she found the same young girl standing alone, eyes wide, watching the sky. The girl turned when she heard footsteps and asked Lyra the question that returned like an echo from another lifetime. Is it true that you were once not chosen by the elders, that they told you you would never lead or teach or bond with anyone? Lyra looked at the girl, her face calm, her mind full of the past, not with sorrow now but with understanding, and she stepped closer and kneeled so their eyes met, and her voice came out softer than the hum of the station around them. Yes, they told me I was not fit. They told me I was not strong enough or worthy enough to be chosen for anything important. They said I had no purpose except to follow. But they were wrong, not because I changed who I was, but because I listened to someone who saw me beyond what they could measure, someone who showed me that worth does not come from approval, but from the way we choose to walk through rejection without letting it change our heart. The girl blinked slowly, taking in every word, and then nodded without reply, as if something deep inside her had shifted, and when she walked away, her steps were not louder, but they were steadier. Lyra remained there alone, watching the endless stars that once seemed so far and empty now looked different. They had not changed, their light had not moved, but her way of seeing them had grown. They were no longer silent reminders of distance. They had become quiet symbols of possible futures, and in their stillness, she felt something rising inside her, not pride in what she had become, but peace in what she had let herself believe. A message arrived that night through her datapad, a simple line from a distant vessel carrying Alex's identifier. It was not long, not full of emotion, just a message that said, "Hope the stars are treating you well. Keep doing what you do. I never doubted you, not even once." She did not reply, but she placed the message beside the mirrored plate, and for the first time, she allowed herself to smile, not because someone had spoken kind words, but because now she believed them without needing to hear them. Again, Lyra stood the next morning ready, before the cycle began, walking toward the task deck, where new shifts would be assigned, and where new voices waited to be guided. And in her walk, there was no hesitation. In her eyes, there was no fear, and in her silence there was no shame, only purpose, only calm, only a voice that had once been hidden, now rising strong, steady, real. And if anyone asked how it all began, she would not speak of machines or ranks or training. She would speak of a moment when a human had seen her not as a number, not as a failure, not as something incomplete, but as someone who was always worthy, just waiting to hear at the end.